Greetings from my small cabin on the eastern shore of Virginia. My name is Mao Van Duren. I maintain this website to post documents, reports, and presentations on topics of interest that deserve a full discussion in the United States. Today, we enjoy the next installment of the presentations by Leonard Giannessi. He discusses Venezuela and the effects of the United States policy on that country. I'm sure you will enjoy the lectures as much as I do. Thank you.
This talk is focused on a recommendation to President Biden that President Biden should cancel the U.S. National Emergency Declaration with respect to Venezuela. On the street, there is a national emergency. According to the President of the United States, there's a national emergency in this country because of what's going on in Venezuela. And what I'm saying is that the President should cancel that declaration. Just a little background on Venezuela. It's the furthest north country in South America. There's 30 million people that live there. 95% of their national income comes from oil sales. And they use income from those oil sales to generate imports of food and medicine and consumer products. So Venezuela is very dependent on foreign trade, very dependent on its oil sales in order to keep the economy and satisfy consumer needs. Now, I'll be mentioning Nicolas Maduro quite a bit in this talk, and just to remind us who he is the president of Venezuela. He was elected in 2013 and then re-elected in 2018. Before that, he was a member of the National Assembly. He'd served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was Vice President for a while. And so the Nicolas Maduro has a big part in what we're going to talk about with this national emergency. Now, we know that the United States President can declare a national emergency, and this is routinely done when there's a hurricane or a big fire or floods. The President basically says there's a national emergency. I've got to take immediate action. So he declares a national emergency, and what that makes is immediate action possible. The President doesn't have to go to Congress and ask for funds to be appropriated. The President can just go out and do things because there's a national emergency. But what is a national emergency that's not the result of a natural disaster? Now, in this case, nothing is defined. Nothing is defined in law. And so scholars who have looked at this issue say it's best to use common sense. If the President declares a national emergency, we've got to make sure that it's a real emergency that includes somehow, maybe it's a threat to the continued existence of the United States. It's sudden and unforeseen, and it requires immediate action. So you can't have a national emergency and do nothing. If you've got a national emergency, you've got to take immediate action. And so basically all we have to guide us is common sense. But what you have in law, what there is in law, is what happens when the President declares a national emergency. That's pretty clear. It's valid for 1 year. It can be renewed. So after a year, the President can say there's still a national emergency, we can renew it. There's 123 standby laws that can only be used by the President if a national emergency is declared. So there's 123 laws. There's lots of statutory authority the President can do if a national emergency is declared. It doesn't need congressional authorization. It can be terminated by a majority vote in Congress if the President signs it. The President's not likely to sign termination of his own national emergency. And so the President obviously can veto a congressional bill. Congressional action would require a 2/3 vote to override the President's veto. It's never happened with one of these national emergencies. But the President, on the other hand, can terminate a national emergency whenever he wants to. So one of the laws that the President can use, and only use if a national emergency is declared, is the IEEPA. And what that is, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The President can impose sanctions on foreign individuals, foreign citizens, can impose sanctions on a foreign country during a national emergency. That's the only time the President can do it, and only if the President claims in the national emergency that the country or person posed it, and I quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. That's the only way that a president can impose sanctions. Has to declare it's an emergency and that the country is an unusual and extraordinary threat. Now, we got a dose of the president declaring a national emergency recently with President Trump declaring a national emergency at our southern border. And this was in 2019, and many critics said this is not a national emergency. What President Trump was doing was playing politics. He made a political promise to build that wall. He promised his supporters he was going to build a wall. And basically, a lot of people say there was no threat, no national emergency, this was politics, and when President Biden got elected, on the first day he was in office, he canceled the emergency. There was no emergency, it was just for political reasons. And there were serious concerns. Serious scholars, like at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, serious scholars and a lot of the public said this is an abuse of presidential powers due to the absence of conditions that meet any common sense definition of an emergency. So many citizens, many publications, many scholars said that you can't just declare, the president should not declare a national emergency unless it passes a common sense test. That there's, yes, we all agree that this is a national emergency for the United States, and Trump's wall declaration did not rise to that level. So why are we talking about Venezuela? Well, because on March the 9th, 2015, President Obama signed an executive order declaring a national emergency due to the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. So you've got President Obama on his own. All he's got to do is sign that piece of paper saying there's a national emergency. It's due to Venezuela posing an extraordinary threat to the United States. And immediately invoked the law, the IEEPA, that allowed him to place sanctions on Venezuela because he had defined it as an extraordinary threat to the United States. So Obama imposed sanctions on 7 officials in Venezuela. He said these 7 officials committed human rights abuses, and I can put sanctions on them because I've defined Venezuela as an extraordinary threat to the United States. He said they were involved in human rights violation. It's not clear what any linkage there was between what those individuals did and the national security of the United States, but that's what President Obama did. Documentation. The United States provided no evidence documenting the human rights abuses of the 7 officials. Just said they violated human rights. Boom. And the United States certainly did not provide any report documenting Venezuela being an extraordinary threat to the United States. You would think as a citizen, if your government is out there saying that this country is an extraordinary threat to our security, that there ought to be a reason, there ought to be a document, there ought to be some explanation to the public as to why. But there has been no report like that. We have to look at what else was going on at the time. What was Obama doing? Well, in early February of 2015, he was working on relations with Cuba. He was, since December of 2014, Castro in Cuba, Raul Castro and Obama said, we're going to normalize relations. We're going to exchange ambassadors. They had bilateral agreements and discussions in Washington and Havana. And in February of 2015, the U.S. air travel to Cuba were lifted. And so on the one hand, in February 2015, Obama is relaxing conditions with Cuba. In March of 2015, he was ratcheting up sanctions on Venezuela. There is a linkage between the two, because what was going on at the time was that Republicans were attacking Obama's Cuba policy. Marco Rubio is running for president. Obama's weak on Cuba. Obama's weak with dictators. And so what Obama did, in order to protect him from that kind of criticism, he took action against Venezuela. And it was seen as a political move. By taking action against Venezuela, he blunted the Republican criticism of what he was doing with Cuba. Now, what were the effects of the 2015 sanctions? A couple of scholars have written about this, and they said, well, many people think that they didn't really do very much. He put some sanctions on 7 officials. That's not very damning. But investors, lenders, buyers of Venezuelan oil, and everyone doing with Venezuela knows exactly what happens when the United States declares a country to be an extraordinary national security threat. You know, the United States is going to take action against those people. The United States is going to place sanctions. The United States is going to want the banks to show that they don't have any transactions with Venezuela. And so the effect of it was just starting. These sanctions in 2015 were just a start. People knew what was coming. What did Maduro do? Well, he went to the National Assembly in Venezuela and said, the United States is making a threat against our country. And so he wanted an emergency power so he could deal with the threat from the United States. The United States, an extraordinarily powerful country, just declared Venezuela to be an extraordinary national security threat. So Maduro told the Assembly, they're coming to get us. They could attack us. So Maduro gets national emergency powers. It required 60% vote in the National Assembly. And when he got the powers, he said, you know what, I had to go to the National Assembly to get approval, and Obama didn't have to do that. Obama just signed a national emergency declaration one morning and didn't have to get anybody to approve it. Maduro went further to mobilize Venezuela's defense forces, 2 weeks of preparation for potential U.S. aggression. Again, the United States declared their country to be a national security threat. And so Maduro says we've got to get ready. They're going to invade us. If we're a national security threat, we have to take action. So he had 20,000 civilian military militia members activated, and 80,000 soldiers paraded in Caracas. And also in Venezuela, there was an effort to circulate a petition where people in Venezuela could demand that the U.S. repeal Obama's decree. And 10 million people by April, just within 1 month of Obama making that decree, more than 10 million people had signed the petition. That's a third of the population of Venezuela saying, we're not a threat to the United States. We're not a national security threat to the United States. What are you talking about? Repeal this. Delcy Rodriguez was Venezuela's foreign minister at the time, and she called what Obama did as a threat to justify intervention. This idea that the United States would be justified in intervening either militarily, politically, whatever, in Venezuela's affairs because Venezuela posed an extraordinary threat to the United States. So what Rodriguez began was a campaign to educate the international community. The first group to support Venezuela in this was CELAC, which is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. You see on this map here in the circle, CELAC represents 33 nations in the Western Hemisphere, excluding Canada and the United States. All of the countries, from Mexico all the way on down, unanimously declared that Obama's executive order should be reversed. You know, she went there, she explained the situation, and all the countries in Latin America said, you got to reverse this. 2 other groups, multinational blocks of nations, also called for the repeal of Obama's decree. There's the non-aligned movements. There's 120, there on the left, you see the non-aligned movement. There are 120 nations in this group, and they voted and pronounced their categorical rejection of Obama's decree. In the United Nations, there's a group of 134 nations, and they also called for the immediate repeal of Obama's declaration. And Obama was subject to a lot of ridicule at the time. This is the president of Ecuador, who went out publicly and who said, who can believe that Venezuela is a danger to the national security of the United States? Who in their right mind can think and accept such a thing? It must be a bad joke. So people were ridiculing Obama about what he had done, declaring Venezuela a national security threat. So what did Obama do? Obama backtracked. In an interview on April the 8th, 2018, Obama said, we don't really believe that Venezuela poses a threat to the United States. In March, he signed a document saying Venezuela was an extraordinary threat to the national security of the U.S. 1 month later, he said, no, I don't really believe that. So what the White House was saying was, well, don't take it too seriously. The executive order is just pro forma. We do this just necessary because we want to, we want to do some things. We want to put some sanctions on people, and we have to say that. We have to say they're an extraordinary risk to the U.S. in order to be able to do what we want. Now, USA Today broke this story. This story was not in the New York Times. It wasn't in the Washington Post. USA Today gets credit because they pointed out the obvious. These emergency declarations have all these ominous signing warnings that foreign governments pose an unusual, extraordinary threat to the U.S. But it's no need to be alarmed. The White House says this is really just formalities, nothing to be concerned about. The extraordinary threat language is so routine, it usually goes unnoticed until it backfired with Venezuela, with the pushback that came from the international community, that came from Venezuela. This is unusual, very unusual for these countries to push back against the United States when the United States makes a declaration like this. Now, the National Lawyers Guild here in the United States said the obvious. They made an obvious statement to Obama. They said, look, if you really believe in the rule of law, you shouldn't be making false declarations based on cynicism, especially ones with such serious consequences. Now, so Obama publicly admitted that Venezuela doesn't pose a threat. So the Lawyers Guild said, cancel the declaration where you said that they were. Maduro came to the UN in September of 2015, and he said, look, the decree that Obama issued in March must be revoked because it's a threat to our country. It has the language right there. Venezuela is an extraordinary threat to the United States. What did Obama do? On March the 3rd, 2016, Obama renewed the decree calling Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. Now, one point, let's remember what Obama did. He sanctioned 7 people in 2015. He didn't do anything else under this emergency order for a whole year. If it's an emergency, shouldn't things have been happening that he needed to take action about? He took no action. He declared an emergency in 2015. He redeclared the emergency in 2016, having done nothing to indicate that it was really an emergency. Now, why did he do that? Well, we get back to Marco Rubio. We get back to politics, a Republican senator. Basically, Rubio, sitting on the Foreign Relations Committee, was holding up an Obama appointment to an ambassadorship. Obama wanted to nominate and confirm an ambassadorship, and Rubio had his thumb on that appointment and wouldn't approve it. So you see what the publication The Hill, outed this arrangement, saying that Rubio and Obama basically made a political deal, that Rubio would end the blockage of the ambassador that Obama wanted, and Obama would put the sanctions back and keep the sanctions on Venezuela, which is what Rubio wanted. So it was a political move. And also, Obama was also dealing with further recognizing Cuba. Actually, Obama went to Cuba. Here he is with Raul Castro in March of 2016. And so he redeclares that emergency declaration on Venezuela. Look, I'm being tough on Maduro, and at the same time that gave him some political coverage for what he wanted to do with Cuba. So he could block some of the criticism of his policies. Now, the United States and Venezuela in 2016 they announced that they were going to work on their relationship. We're going to improve diplomatic relations. We're going to exchange ambassadors. You see Secretary Kerry with the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry. You see Under Secretary of State Tom Shannon with Maduro and Rodriguez. And, the United States and Venezuela is certainly not treating it like a national security threat. Let's improve our relations. So then what happened? Well, Donald Trump was elected president in November of 2016. And Maduro once again went out before Trump was inaugurated and said, please, Obama, please reverse this. You can, with a signing of your pen, you can cancel this emergency declaration. It's not going to expire until Trump is into his presidency. So please cancel this before Trump becomes president. And again, Obama hadn't done anything under the executive order for another year. So Obama sanctioned 7 people in 2015. He hadn't done anything under the emergency order for 2 years. He renewed it for political reasons, and now he's facing, what am I going to do now? Trump is going to assume office. And he still hadn't treated it like an emergency. He hadn't done anything to indicate it was an emergency. Well, Obama, in one of his final acts, 5 days before Trump assumed the presidency, Obama renewed the executive order declaring Venezuela an extraordinary threat to the United States. He didn't have to do that. It was going to, he could have waited. Trump would have had to deal with it in March, but Obama said, well, I better deal with it right away because Trump might miss it. And so Obama took this action. Instead of canceling it, he renewed it. Hadn't done anything to indicate it was an emergency for 2 years. So now the policies going forward from that day in the hands of these two leaders, President Trump and his National Security Advisor, John Bolton. So these guys took a different action. Now Trump, of course, renewed the executive order declaring Venezuela a national security threat. All Trump had to do in 2018, 2019, 2020 was just sign a piece of paper saying Venezuela is a national security threat to the United States, an extraordinary national security threat. But there was some movement on what the policy was all about. John Bolton, in his book, sort of indicates what Trump was all about. Trump wanted Nicolas Maduro out as president of Venezuela, and basically Bolton says Trump told him, let's get Maduro out. Let's apply maximum pressure to get Maduro out. Well, with John Bolton understood the power of sanctions, and again in his book, sanctions are about using America's massive economic power to advance our national interests. They're most effective when applied massively, swiftly, and decisively, enforced with all the power available. Bolton knew what that executive order that Obama had handed him was capable of. He had massive power under the laws because there was a national emergency, massive power against Venezuela. And so Trump really is the one who used the sanctions. You know, all Obama had ever done was sanction 7 people. That was it. What did Trump do? He sanctioned 102 Venezuelans. He prohibited Venezuela's access to U.S. financial markets. He prohibited transactions purchasing Venezuelan debt, and he prohibited all transactions with Venezuela's oil industry. And the prohibitions were extended worldwide. So basically, you know, I pointed out at the start that Venezuela is very dependent on selling oil. 95% of its national income comes from oil sales. And basically what Trump said is nobody in the world can buy oil from Venezuela. If you're buying oil from Venezuela, you're violating U.S. sanctions. We can fine you. We can bring sanctions against you if you're importing oil from Venezuela. And so Bolton understood the power that Obama had given him. Now, some scholars have written about how much damage has been done to Venezuela. An economist at the Washington office on Latin America said U.S. sanctions cost Venezuela between $17 and $31 billion in revenue. That was through October of 2020. And again, they used that revenue to buy imports of food, imports of medicine, and we had essentially dried up that revenue. Bolton wrote about the situation in Venezuela again in his book, The Room Where It Happened. Bolton said it was really those oil sanctions. We thought they were going to be a major blow to Maduro's regime and that it would just be a matter of time before it fell. Because again, 95% of the country's income is from oil sales. And the United States basically was prohibiting anyone in the world buying oil from Venezuela. And so basically Bolton is saying Maduro's going to fall. This is a really powerful move. But Maduro's presidency has survived. The Washington office on Latin America wrote a report in December of last year. The Maduro government appears more consolidated than any point since 2019, and there's no indication that the sanctions are going to have a change in governments. Well, why is that? Why has Maduro not been defeated? The people remain loyal in their defense of the government. James Petrus from Binghamton University. The mass of people have gotten a better life under the governments of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, installing dignity and respect. 24 universities were built for the poor. Public hospitals and clinics were built in poor nations. The vast majority of Venezuelans oppose U.S. intervention in support of the puppet opposition. So the vast majority of Venezuelans aren't going to give up on Maduro because his government has provided them with benefits, and there's no trust of people that are supported by the United States. So Trump fired Bolton. Trump fired Bolton in September 2019. And, you know, I don't often agree with Donald Trump, but look what he said about John Bolton. He said, I disagreed with John Bolton on his attitude on Venezuela. I think he was way out of line. So Trump empowered him, but then Bolton just went off and did these things. All Trump really wanted was to have a meeting with Maduro. He wanted a face-to-face meeting like he had with the leader of North Korea or Putin, where Trump sits down with one of these authoritarian leaders and he has his photo op. That's all he wanted. And Bolton prevented that from happening. Bolton would not let Trump meet with Maduro. Bolton kept up the pressure, really ratcheted it up on the emergency. Now, the United Nations has sent a couple of rapporteurs to Venezuela to check on human rights. And the one in 2017, Alfred de Zayas, went to Venezuela in 2017. You can see he was former Secretary of the UN Human Rights Council. And they sent him down to Venezuela to assess human rights. Well, he was really damning on the effect of U.S. sanctions. The sanctions imposed by Obama and Trump have directly and indirectly aggravated shortages of food and medicine. The sanctions have contributed to many deaths. The International Criminal Court should open an investigation into the crimes against humanity committed by the United States. So these sanctions imposed by Trump and Bolton got way out of hand. And they were causing the United States to be depicted as a violator of basic human rights. In February of this year, the UN sent another rapporteur down, Elena Duhan. She was sent to Venezuela to look at the impact of sanctions on human rights. She released her preliminary report in February. Her final report is going to come out in September. Here's what she said. On the effects of sanctions. Impediments to food imports have resulted in steady growth of malnourishment. That's what our sanctions are doing. Our sanctions that can only be applied because the president declared Venezuela an extraordinary threat, resulting in the steady growth of malnourishment. Low-income people, women, children, they're effective most with regard to the whole scope of human rights. That's what our sanctions are doing. To the people of Venezuela, and the only way that the president can impose those sanctions is to say it's a national security threat. So Duhan concluded this way on the U.S. emergency declaration. The UN Special Rapporteur urges the United States government to end the national emergency regarding Venezuela. I'm not the only one who's calling for the cancellation of the national emergency. Here you have a rapporteur from the United Nations saying this national emergency declaration has to go because these sanctions are simply really having this negative effect. So we come to President Biden now. The national emergency with respect to Venezuela was due to expire on March the 8th of 2021. And so what did Biden do? Well, on March the 3rd, Biden signed an annual extension saying the situation in Venezuela continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Same exact language that's been in place since 2015. There is a national emergency, a serious national emergency, extraordinary threat to the United States. And again, who really believes that? Did Biden believe that when he signed that order, or was he just doing it for political reasons? Anyway, in my view, the emergency declaration should be canceled. It is clearly not factual. Venezuela is not a national security threat to the U.S. It simply is not. President Obama admitted that it was a fraudulent declaration that he made. It's based on political considerations. It's an abuse of presidential power. It's allowed the United States to place sanctions on Venezuela, which have done great harm to the Venezuelan people. And at the end of the day, it has not been successful in removing Maduro as president. And so in my view, the emergency declaration has done far more harm than good, and it should be canceled. Thank you.